But it's also very gratifying because every day I get to sort of, I can see some of my white students, they have never been told to contest things. And sometimes in journalism, the history of this country. And so I every single day, every single lesson has to do with that. And so, like I said, that can be stressful, but I've had some wins, you know, being able to bring Amanda Seals to the department to talk. That was like something I had to fight for, you know. But I still, on the back end, was told I had to get insurance for what ended up being a virtual event. You know, these are things where when we talk about like how our students are exposed, you know, we have to, I think they might step into an African American studies department with the idea that they're going to become woke. I think students step into my classroom, especially the Black students, they step into my classroom thinking that because they're Black, by default, they should get an A. And so I think the other thing to mention is that, no, and it's true. And one of the things that also has to be said is that this is also about within race, us having a critical understanding of what's happened to us and not accepting everything as default. Because I also have met students who are African American who perpetuate some of the things that we're accusing white folks of doing as well. So I think that's also my job, is to come into the space and kind of reimagine it. And so, you know, I'm doing that threefold, you know, and that's within the work, that's within public scholarship, and that's also within teaching, and hopefully within, you know, changing some of the narratives within the department on how race should be taught and how modalities can be accepted. You know, I hear this, you know, you eloquently talked about decolonization, and I'll put this out there and I'll shut up. One of the things that really is important to me as someone as an activist in social work is recognizing the strength of Blackness and not censoring all of our conversations about resistance and oppression, but also foregrounding Black joy, also foregrounding Black beauty, also foregrounding Black creativity. And I think in the space of talking about mass communication, it's one of those spaces where we've flourished and we've always been at the vanguard, but our stuff always gets stolen, you know, and people take credit for it. And so that's the other thing that I like to talk about in our classroom is ownership, and how we need to own our stories, own our narratives. And that sometimes has to start with my Black students understanding why I'm talking about race, not just because I'm Black and it's a Black teacher, it's gonna be all good, you know.
Thank you. I look forward to reading Dr. Evans's book because the work that I do in my book project also looks at informal Black legal education. So what does a people who was denied the ability to read and write under slavery do with legal knowledge? Black people are litigating during the antebellum period, and they've continued to litigate in a certain way into the 21st century. So further kind of centering these Black stories. But also in my classroom, I have my students read primary source documents. I have them read the Articles of Secession. I have them read some of the letters that were written on behalf of People who are donating these monuments. We do exercises where we revise the monuments, because one of the things that I think came up earlier is this idea that curriculum is political. If we don't talk about the fact that politicians set curricula, if we don't talk about motivations that people might have for assigning certain types of texts, then our students can't understand what it is that they weren't taught. And they can't understand the depth of what they're learning in history. And when I got here, I was a little nervous, in part because I do work on Jim Crow. And so one of the things that I leaned most heavily on was using primary source documents. Somebody can say I'm lying to you, but the document doesn't lie. I'm giving you a hard copy of what somebody from the time actually said and wrote. And I think that's really important to just remind our students that there's going to be political commentary. All right, cool. We go back to the source. We go back to the court case. We go back to the law. We go back to the document. That way you can decide for yourself what you believe actually happened. You can decide for yourself which narrative is most appropriate. And one of the other things that I do in my AFM classes is we read a little bit of Black Reconstruction and the propaganda of history. The propaganda of history, where we start to think about, from someone living during the time, what it meant to be in control of the narrative. And so we think about the ways that history is manipulated to erase our people, to erase the struggle of other minoritized people in this country. And with that, I will stop. So
in schools, we are not really trained as teachers, or we don't, and the schools don't have the capacity to talk about race from a perspective of trauma. So, as an educator, when I'm in the classroom, I try to really create a culture of healing and express to my students that racial trauma is real and it really impacts how you contextualize what's happening around you. And racial trauma lives in everyone. It doesn't matter if you're Black or white, or, it doesn't matter your race. So understanding how trauma informs or impacts learning and impacts the brain, I think would better help us prepare to address feelings of guilt and discomfort, because it's uncomfortable. I mean, it's unsettling, and it's not meant to be comfortable, to have these kinds of conversations. And my job as an educator, I see teaching as like activism and like resistance, because I want to push my students to challenge each other and, as it was brought up just a moment ago, use evidence to back up your argument, and and do that from a space of love and healing, because we're not trying to create more trauma for the next person who's not within our community. I think creating community where, for healing is how we can first start to even accept that these conversations need to be had, and accept that there is a political agenda when it comes to curriculum. And that when you understand, because my students, like I said, I teach in Atlanta, they are so close to the criminal justice system. They see it all the time. And so just to kind of wrap back to my point earlier, when you have the text that says that the 13th Amendment bans slavery, and the only thing that the test question is asking you to answer is which amendment bans slavery, that's not enough, because you're leaving out the part that says unless you commit a crime. And so when you understand that slavery is permissible when you commit a crime, you're able to say, okay, so then what does that mean? Why is it okay to be enslaved when you commit a crime? Why did they make that okay? Then you understand how the country benefits from slavery in an economic way. And then you understand that, okay, so the country is still benefiting from exploiting a certain group. And so, but then in that, it's not to say that you're blaming the other person who doesn't look like you. It's that together you are healing through understanding why that's the case and figuring out together how can we problem solve to really push those boundaries as a community. Something that was really disheartening that I heard my students say was we talked about integration and desegregation. And so I said, you know, if this court case ended segregation, why is this school 100% Black? And my student said, because it's a Black community and the whole community is Black. I said, okay, so why do only Black people live in this community? Nobody else want to move here. Well, why not? Because it's a bad community. Don't nobody want to move here. And it's just like, so I want to prepare them to be able to advocate for themselves. Sometimes the language is inaccessible, but to give them the language, give them the tools to be able to understand redlining, to be able to understand how this is not by chance, and to do that again from a space of healing. And, you know,
pedagogically, I think it's really important to elaborate on the idea that Blackness is antecedent to whiteness, which is also to say that whiteness is antecedent to anti-Blackness. And so for me, that concept animates all of my teaching and all of my conversations with folks, that especially working in, again, that vector Black studies I was describing earlier, it's so easy to theorize ourselves away to say that there's a kind of complete social and political death that's more than just symbolic theoretical jargon that speaks to the conditions that Black folks have lived here at least since 1619. And what it means to rest also means that there's been
everybody gone. The people that was here.
Sources for richness and resilience and healing. And a lot of those sources aren't just responses or reactions to the forms of violence, psychic, physical, communal, the expressions of anti-Blackness.
No, it went off.
So that idea expresses itself in a variety of ways. The signal one is that when I teach Black feminist theory, for example, which is a course that all our majors and minors take, I make very explicit, to riff off of what Professor Evans was saying, that Black feminist thought and that tradition of activism and intellectual labor should not be thought of as adjunct to any other form of feminism. That, of course, Black feminism internally does not draw a color line, that it's open to all forms of
and tomorrow
from other women of color.
Very quiet.
And yet,
Please mute yourself.
its apparatus, its modes of thought, its interventions have very little to do with first, second, or third wave white feminism. And so that kind of set of ideas for what it means to kind of center Blackness and be able to define Blackness internally and intramurally therefrom is really central to everything I do.
I just love this conversation, and I just want to jump in and try to contextualize what we're hearing, right? I think in some ways, what I appreciate so much about critical race theory as a method is the ability to elevate the importance of storytelling, right, of narrative, and also to challenge us to think critically about what the purpose of education is. Right, I think as a society, we tend to think about education as a means to an end, which is a means to employment. There is in many ways and society, right? Interaction with society is a kind of trauma. And that trauma is told, generally speaking, through a single frame the concept of Black power in a negative light, and as a kind of resistance that was toxic and harmful, and that frustrated the goals of civil rights, had to be struck down. And if you position that against the kind of power that the sort of colonial community perpetrated against the British Empire, right? We have a different conception of what that kind of cultural power means historically. So it's interesting when you think about history through different lenses. The other thing I just wanted to amplify that you so beautifully said by Ms. Ross was this notion of how education is also a space to deal with trauma. And we don't often talk about how we experience trauma in the classroom, not just students of color, but also white students as well. I think often white students tend to experience it as a kind of anxiety, right? A racial anxiety and a reticence to talk through these things because there's a fear of that background. Whereas I think students who are racialized as minorities tend to often experience a sense of insecurity about their belonging, right? So Ms. Ross mentioned asking her students, why is this community Black, in the sense of, well, it's a bad community, right? Internalizing some of those negative stereotypes. And the final point that I thought was really interesting was, what Dr. Lee mentioned, was this notion that some of these concepts around Blackness, around feminism, are actually accessible to everyone in terms of thinking about the value they add to the way we think about human well-being more generally. And so I think that's really interesting to think about in general in terms of what happens in the classroom. I want to shift a little bit and talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And someone made one of my colleagues, a law professor at another school, made an interesting comment the other day about the fact that the percentage of Black students at a certain school had actually been the same. It was consistent. It was like the same exact percentage over the course of decades. And you often see this happen in many schools where it just so happens that there are exactly 7% of this race and 4% of that. And so it's an interesting concept when we think about what are we trying to achieve with diversity? How are schools implementing it? What is the value? Why are things staying the same? Why aren't they changing? What are we getting wrong? So I love your thoughts, because I think this conversation is also very much connected to what we mean by diversity, what we mean by equity and inclusion, and what should that look like in the classroom. You're talking more on a substantive level, but from like a structural level, right? What should we be striving for what our classroom looks like? What do you think the goal of DEI should be? What more do we need to do?
So for me, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I like to make the analogy, it reminds me of my son when he was in elementary school, right? Diversity is everyone gets invited to the birthday party. It doesn't matter who you are. Equity is everybody is allowed to dance on the dance floor at the birthday party. Inclusion is saying everybody has a turn with the aux cord. And so in the classroom, it can't just be, okay, I use this Black scholar and he's in the syllabus. It can't just be, I foregrounded one slide or 1 week, and I'm guilty of this at times, right? I beat myself up over this. Like I have 1 week where I do career studies and I'm like, yo, that's so whack. I know it's whack. But like in trying to shape my course, it's taking me time to develop, right? And take it on from someone else and then shape shift it. But like things like that, where it's like, oh, I'm gonna give you guys a week, I'm gonna give feminism a week, I'm gonna give everyone a week. That's not really being structurally equitable, because ultimately a lot of our conversations are still centered around how we are counter to whiteness. And I think what I've tried to do in my classes next semester in the fall, I'm actually teaching a class called Hip Hop Media and Society, right? And like one of the things that I'm trying to do with that course is to foreground again, like, you know, something that I talked to my friend Andre Brock, who's at Georgia Tech. We talk about Black techno culture and like how, you know, we express ourselves, and how, you know, the system, while it may have been rigged against us, we still have our spaces that are safe for us, that are dope, and continually, time and time again, show up in ways that put us at the vanguard, right? And so I like to highlight that at the forefront, and I try to make whiteness not the default. I try to make Black the default. And I think that's really, you know, it's one of those things that I think I'm very intentional, and I'm okay with evaluations from white students saying he talked the whole time about Blackness. I'm okay with that, because you know what, the rest of your curriculum is going to give you all the time in the world to not talk about Blackness, right? But I also feel like it shouldn't just be something that's an elective in departments like mine. It should be something that you should have to take, because race is something we have to reckon with. And that's what C.R.T. is saying. You know, it's saying that, you know, you all created this social construct, right? And it's always been here. So why can't we reckon with it and contest the power that comes within these titles, and how that shows up for me in media, how it shows up in representations that we take in on an everyday basis. I think media is embedded in everything now. So really, it's an iterative process for me. It's one of those things where I think back to every class that I've had at every level, and then I think about what I would have wanted to have done differently. Even though I was a nerd and I was able to thrive in these colonial systems, right? But informally, the stuff that I did outside of school is what shaped who I actually am as a scholar. And so, you know, again, that sort of shameless plug, that's what the book is arguing for, is that the things that Black youth are doing outside of school should be allowed in school. And that's more so at the early ed, elementary school, high school levels. But in spaces like this, where our best and brightest are showing up, you know, the departments and the faculties have to be reflective of the diversity of their audience. So we're often concerned about just filling seats, but for a while we didn't have any tenured Black professors, really enough of those around to go around, you know, and we can't just bring them in as instructors and adjuncts and make them feel insecure. We have to create safe spaces, you know, and how that happens here, I'm still gaining institutional knowledge by the day, but you know, my hope is that the more creative I can be, and the more freedom I'm given to be creative, the more we're going to see things show up in my department that we don't have to point out diversity, equity, or inclusion, because it's just known everybody gets to hold the aux cord.
I think sorry, y'all. I think that in my classrooms, because I try to incorporate non-Black people while still also centering Blackness, I try to take an approach where I'm inviting all of my diverse students in. Like, this is a Black story and you're a part of it. There's a reason that the South Carolina and Mississippi Black codes charge a fine higher for white people for associating with Black people than they did for Black people, because proximity to Blackness and allyship has a cost as well. And so when we're thinking about centering Blackness, I think that we can do that and show cross-racial collaborations and show how this anti-Black system then imposes similar or harsher punishments onto non-Black allies. And so I think that would be the thing that I would add to what Dr. Evans said, but I also take similar approaches. It's not enough for me to go, I have 5 Black people and 5 white people on my syllabus. Those people have to be at the heart. Those voices have to come out in my primary sources. They have to be visible all the way throughout.
I think diversity, equity, and inclusion are just, it's interesting to see how it plays out in higher education specifically. I think it is a coveted group of words, but when I was in grad school, I noticed part of it was online due to COVID, but then I was able to be in person for another part of it. And I realized that, some of my friends and peers who were non-native English speakers, were in the class. And of course, it seems diverse when you walk into the room and you have people from all kinds of countries, from every continent. But I would have conversations with them outside of class, and I was just so interested in how language plays into what they say in class or how they participate, or just what that looks like for them. And I realized, and participation is a grade on our syllabi in grad school. And so I realized that, for some of my friends whose first language is Arabic and they just came, they're new to the US, to participate just is so much anxiety because everyone else is speaking so quickly and they have such big words, and they barely understand the readings. And so to participate just creates a level of anxiety, along with, and of course this is just from some people's experiences, I'm not sure what the research says, but another layer of it is we have a capstone at the end of our studies. And so we had to create a policy brief, and, it's written in English. And so when you have such a complex document that you're having to research for and this and that, I started to ask the question of if students can't choose to do these things in their native language, is it equitable? Is it inclusive? So when you have trainings for faculty and for students on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the students can't do any of their assessments in their native language, they're graded on participation when participating creates anxiety. I just wonder, is it really equity? Is it really equitable? Is it really inclusive? So I hope that makes sense, but I wonder if we really talk to students about what fears do they face in the classroom. And, I have friends who've gotten feedback on their writing in grad school, and it's so focused on syntax and it's so focused on grammar, and it's just like, I'm trying. I don't know. So I think that's interesting. And so I would just push higher education institutions or institutions of higher education to give voice to their student body when thinking about DEI.
I appreciate that so much. As a former ESL student, I grew up in this town in North Carolina called Chapel Hill. I was there when I was 6. And I was thinking about it on Saturday night, watching hoops. That I remember my first grade ESL teacher didn't teach us navy blue versus sky blue. We were taught Duke blue versus Carolina blue. And so that's been part of my American lexicon ever since. Well, I remember about a year ago, I read this amazing essay in Current Affairs called American Fugitive. And in that essay, Professor Toussaint talks about, at the end, this kind of presence of human dignity that should be at the center of everything that Black folks have fought for and strived for. And I love that tension that's set up in that essay between this notion of Black fugitivity and human dignity. And the thing I would say in my pedagogy, especially as it relates to questions of DEI and institutional inclusion and recognition, is that ultimately, if we heed Professor Derek Bell's diagnosis that white supremacy, anti-Blackness is a permanent fixture, then there's only so much we can do with our very human desire for inclusion, recognition, and even dignity within these anti-Black institutions. And so what that means at the kind of microsocial level in terms of the pedagogy, in terms of the kinds of conversations I want to have, is to foreground the notions of fugitivity and of escape and of underground socialities. And that's really not easy to do sometimes because, as Dr. Evans was saying, you know, school is our hustle, right? This is what we do. We're good at school, we're good at the institution. And yet we have to be able to try to foster and develop, for the sake of our own dignity, a politics of refusing that desire for recognition and inclusion. And I think that is possible. And I think it's possible to live with that contradiction of wanting that kind of outsider status, as long as you have some other stuff intramurally, cool stuff, healing stuff, joy stuff that's happening on the other side of that. And that's really hard to do, in part because the institutions really grind us down. They demand so much out of us. They demand everything you got, right? Including your credit, right? Including your family finances and so on. And so it's hard to sometimes talk about that in institutional settings. And yet from where I'm sitting, that's what the history of Black studies is to be able to talk about how it is and what it is that Black folks have been able to do under these conditions of transhistorical anti-Blackness, and be able to do that in a way that maintains that dignity.
This is so rich. It's so rich, and I love this notion that I'm just gonna think a lot about the that Ms. Ross said, the anxiety of participation. And when you think about the very essence of democracy is the ability to participate. And so when your participation is mediated by your anxiety, that really calls into question the legitimacy of the democracy itself, right? Which maybe connects back to the early discussion around Afro-pessimism, that you can never really be free, because ultimately this is a question about language. And for you as law students, right, like, what is the language of law? How does that language surface in the classroom, and how does that engage with different lived experiences around speaking, right? And these very fundamental principles like liberty, equality, like what does liberty mean in different languages, right? Different American languages, to say it in a different way. We could talk about this all night. I want to provide a space as we sort of transition toward the close for the audience to share some questions. I would love for you to engage. What is on your mind? What are some things that you're thinking? And I just want to open it up, see what questions you might have. Go ahead. I'll let the audience jump in. I'll let the panelists jump in. That's such a complex question, and I'll give my 2 cents. I think there are so many ways that you could explore history to think about how people of color and I hate the phrase people of color, but I just use it for simplicity because people of color include all of us, including white people. But if you look throughout history, you know, and I'll talk specifically about Black people, there have been different viewpoints about that very thing, right? You could say that some people were trying to fight within the system for civil rights to try to get more seats at the table, as it were, through greater participation, right, voting. And other people were saying, we're going to build our own table. In fact, we're about to be out of this place. Like we are leaving. Goodbye. Like, I'm trying to get all my folks, we're about to get on a boat. Marcus Garvey's like, we're out. Right? And so there's different conceptions of what it means to be free. But I think to your point, it's a very complicated question, and I'm curious what I kind of think about.
I guess it depends on how we're setting our intention, and then where we're setting our intention. So if we're thinking about higher ed, I think it's very top of mind for me because I'm first year and just was hired here, and I can think about like the job market and how that was during the COVID year. So it was a tale of two academias, I guess, right? On the one hand, while we're sitting here discussing people doubling down on getting rid of C.R.T., there were people also doubling down on saying we got to have a race guy, right? So there were like a jillion calls. I'm overestimating, but there were a lot of calls for professors who do anything that touches upon critical race theory, and that was in every discipline. So I saw, learning sciences calls for someone who does work in marginalized communities and thinks about critical race theory. And then everybody I know who's on the same listservs are applying to the same job, right? And then there's a civic media call. We want to foreground those who think about critical race theory, or, even here, the reason I chose USC was the fact that we had a cohort. They brought in 6 of us, which to me showed a commitment to bringing not just, one person in to play a diversity card, but we brought someone in advertising. We brought someone in journalism. We brought someone in who thinks about social media. We brought someone in. So pretty much all around the board, we brought someone in. I said I'm the only, so I'm not the only, but I'm the only in my meetings, right? And so I think on the one hand, I think part of it is sharing the wealth, because I know people who got PhDs who have no interest in academia, and part of it is for me to say, hey, if I got a grant, how can I include you? Because they're like, you do the academic thing, because I used to do community work. And so a lot of my folks in that space are like, you flipped on us. You're going to go write these books. You're going to go to Harvard for this fellowship. And you're going to get on TV and you're going to forget about the groundwork that we did, when you were doing casework. Do you remember that? And so practitioners, folks who were in schools, they're also like, how you talk your little fancy theory and all that. But we have to think about when our movement was its strongest, we all were together. And that was the gangsters, that was the academics, that was the teachers, that was the store owners, that was everybody. That was the real estate agents, So we have to set our intentions in ways where, and I've been spoiled because being in Chicago, we have a great deal of Black political power there, as much as the media might want lead you to believe otherwise, that we're just violent, but it's really not. We probably have the second most amount of Black millionaires in our country. And so I've been able to see how that can manifest in places like Bronzeville and places like South Shore. And, how that comes here to Columbia, South Carolina is something I think about every day, right? But I think it starts with you. We each got to take our own bit of the pie and set that intention, commit to it, and push forward. And so, like, it's a heavy push, It's definitely a complicated question, but it's also one that I think we can attack if we all take our own little corners of it.
You guys, thanks for bearing with me because I don't know why the Zoom keeps tapping out. I'm gonna go back into the meeting. Let's see. Okay. Obviously, they're having some technical difficulties because the meeting goes out every now and then. Let me see. Bear with me. Thank you. Please like, please subscribe, please share. This is a very important conversation that needs to be had. I don't know what's going on with this. Let's see. Okay. Cheese. Um, you guys, I have no idea what just happened to the stream because they just it's saying waiting for the host to start the meeting again. I don't understand. The Zoom meeting just clicked off. I have no idea. I'm trying to relaunch it, but it's saying waiting for the host to accept it, which I have no idea why that would happen. Let's just see. This is passcode. It just booted everybody out, and now it's saying it's waiting for the host to start the meeting, which I don't know what's going on, you guys. Maybe that was the end of it, but it didn't have a formal ending to it. Wow. Really? Okay, y'all. Listen. This was a great debate about critical race theory. It's very important that we have this conversation. They touched on a lot of great topics. My daughter was one of the speakers there. Her name is Ayana Ross, and she has her master's, which she has stated in international development in teaching. So, hi, Mark. Hey, global love. I'm so glad to see you. I'm so glad to see you up in here, Mark. You know, I really love you. You're so dear to me. You know, I really love you, Mark, for real. And hopefully we'll just get together and collaborate on some things because I'm sure that you can just inform me and you can inform so many other people of like so much going on over there in Lagos and whatnot. So thank you for tuning in. But I think I'm going to end this right here because I'm taking it that this is over at this point because it keeps stating that they're just waiting for someone to accept the meeting. So I'm just like, Let me see, leave the meeting. Maybe they went on a break, y'all. Maybe this is an intermission or something. I don't know. Join. Let me see. I'm gonna try this one last time. Paste. PRX. All right, y'all. I think it's a wrap. And even if it's an intermission, this is gonna be a wrap. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me, bearing in this just with me as I just work on this channel. I truly appreciate you. Those that tuned in, those that tune in later, please like, subscribe, share. Please just be patient and work with me. And as I get this together, I'm really liking this. Like it's a grassroots operation. Okay. So this is happening very organically. And I really am grateful actually the way it's rolling out, because you know, you have to be appreciative. You also have to be grateful at each and every step, you know. And with that being said, thank you. I appreciate you guys. Love you. Have a wonderful day and see you next time. And next time I come, I intend to just speak some more about crypto. Like I'm an investor, I'm an engineer. I invest in crypto and I understand a lot about crypto and all things dealing with like DeFi, which is decentralized finance, blockchain, hash graph, all that type of stuff. So thanks for tuning in. You have a wonderful day. Bye.